That bastard! He activated the emulators! You filthy bastard! Stop the emulators now!
The modern JRPG enthusiast is often told that entry into the greats requires a blood sacrifice of time. To understand the golden era, one must purportedly submit to a 150-hour task, wading through glacial combat systems, outdated navigation, and the narrative padding of a bygone era. We're told to appreciate the payoff of a trilogy, we must first earn it through the suffering of the setup. But in a landscape increasingly defined by AAA slop, massive polished experiences that offer 1,000 miles of surface area with the depth of a parking lot puddle, the traditional path to fandom feels less like a journey and more like a sunk cost fallacy. I chose a different path. I decided to play Xenosaga the worst way possible, not out of a lack of respect for the franchise, but as a radical experiment in efficiency. If a story is truly biblically accurate in its scale and ambition, it should be able to survive the meat grinder of a modern optimization. My methodology was simple, yet to the purist, it's heresy. I would skip the first 80 hours of gameplay, download the narrative through a mid-anime adaptation, watch that 3 times speed while running on a treadmill. There's a specific type of zen that occurs when you're on a treadmill, your heart rate is elevated, and you're forcing your brain to process information at 3 times the intended speed. Most people view 3 times speed as the way to get through content, but for the modern consumer, it functions more as a filter for substance. When you accelerate media, the fluff, the long pauses, the recycled animation, and the narrative stalling falls away. What remains is the raw, jagged edge of a story's intent. Watching the Toei Xenosaga anime in this state was a revelation. The community generally regards this adaptation as mid, a pale imitation of the first game's cinematic ambitions. However, when viewed through the lens of a high-octane sensory overload, the jank of the 2005 animation disappears. It is replaced by a high-density stream of Gnostic imagery, religious allegories, and mecha industrial design that felt more correct at 3 times speed than most modern shonen does at 1. I found myself more engaged with the plight of Shion Uzuki and the cold mechanical mystery of Cosmos in a single hour-long treadmill session than I've done with dozens of hours of peak shonen like Naruto. Why? Because Xenosaga is narratively thick. Even in its most criticized form, it possesses a density of ideas, a biblically accurate Star Wars vibe that survives the acceleration. Naruto, by comparison, feels like empty calories at 3 times speed. The filler becomes unbearable when the pacing is forced. But with Xenosaga, the acceleration only served to emphasize the weight of its world building. It felt less like watching a show and more like a cyberpunk style data transfer directly into my psyche. We live in an era where games are designed to respect our engagement metrics more than our time. The AAA slop I often critique thrives on the idea that more is always better. More map markers, more crafting materials, more content to justify a $70 price tag. In this environment, my unhinged methodology is a form of rebellion. I am refusing to give the time tax its due. By jumping straight from the anime and the AI briefing into Xenosaga Episode 3, I am testing a thesis. Does the soul of a masterpiece require the grind of its predecessors? The purists argue that you cannot care about a character unless you have personally controlled them through 60 hours of turn-based combat. I argue that if the writing is potent enough and the aesthetic is striking enough, the vibe is transferable. The Toei anime, for all its flaws, absolutely succeeded in planting the seeds of that vibe. It established the horror of the Gnosis, those celestial, untouchable invaders, and the clinical, almost welcoming architectural beauty of the series' world building. By the time I finished that final mile on the treadmill, I didn't feel like I had cheated. I felt like I had been briefed for a mission. I had the emotional shorthand required to understand the stakes without the exhaustion of the PS2 era encounter rates. There is a unique beauty in mid-media and black sheep titles. They often possess a raw, unpolished ambition that is sanded down in a more successful quote-unquote perfect games. This is why I tend to play series in the most unorthodox orders, tackling Metal Gear Solid from 5 to 4 to Peace Walker before I even touch Snake Eater. I want to see how the world holds up when viewed out of sequence. Xenosaga is the ultimate test of this. It is a franchise that was supposed to be 6 parts and was cut down to 3. A series that changed art directors and battle systems like a person changing clothes. It is inherently fractured. By approaching it in a fractured way, anime to AI, then to the final game, I am interacting with Xenosaga on its own chaotic terms. As I stepped off the treadmill, drenched in sweat, and having downloaded the entirety of episode 1, I've realized that the biblically accurate way to play the series wasn't to follow the manual, it was to embrace the madness. I was now ready to consult the Oracle, to use AI to bridge the 20-year gap of lost media and mobile exclusive lore, to see if I could finally reach the promised land of episode 3. Now that the vibe of Xenosaga was firmly lodged into my brain, the narrative map was still full of holes. I had the broad strokes of episode 1, the Gnosis, the Zohar, the stoic efficiency of Cosmos, but there was a decade of missing history standing between me and episode 3. The purest solution would be to play the second game, endure its notoriously divisive combat system, then scour the internet for translated scripts of the Japan-only mobile game Pied Piper and the Flash visual novels. I chose a more modern, slightly more disturbed methodology. I sat down, popped a Zen, and went, ChatGPT. I simply needed a lore dispensing machine. I needed to perform a surgical extraction of 20 years of convoluted Gnostic sci-fi history in the span of a single hour. I was just firing questions into the void and watching the void blink back with answers about 6,000-year-old space reincarnations. I started with the basics. Can I skip Xenosaga 2? The answer didn't matter. I had already decided what the answer was. But I needed the AI to justify my heresy. I asked the AI to explain everything that happened between the first and third games, including the obscure side media that even most die-hard fans haven't even actually touched. But I didn't want a dry Wikipedia summary. I told the AI, nah, write it like a book for me. I wanted the narrative weight. I wanted to feel the tragedy of Ziggy's past as a human named John Sauer without having to play an obscure mobile game from 2004. I wanted to understand why Shion Uzuki harbored such a visceral resentment toward her father and the trauma surrounding her mother's death. The AI became an oracle, bridging the gap between the mid-animation of the Toei series and the high-stakes melodrama of the final game. It briefed me on the Testaments, those masked men who acted as the series' dark apostles, and the vessels of Anima that powered their colossal mechs. It was a narrative briefing for a mission I was about to undertake. As the chat progressed, the questions grew more esoteric. Are the references to the Bible just symbolic like a Neon Genesis Evangelion, or should I read into it? I was looking for the Dante's Inferno connection I thought the game resembled. I wanted to know if the religious allegories were just cool looking window dressing, or were they the literal engine of the plot? The Oracle didn't disappoint. It began weaving a tale of Mary Magdalene, a character who wasn't even mentioned in the anime I had just finished, and her connection to Shion from 6 millennia prior. It explained the Zohar, the golden monolith that serves as a series MacGuffin, not as a simple power source, but as a gateway to the divine. At this point, the experiment was no longer about skipping content. It was about information optimization. I was bypassing the bloat, the repetitive turn-based battles, and the fetch quests to get straight to the philosophical marrow of the franchise. I asked about Wilhelm, the enigmatic CEO who seemed to be playing a game of 4D chess with the universe. I asked about Udo, the wave existence that threatened to collapse reality. I was outsourcing the grind to focus entirely on the biblically accurate scale of the story. Was this the optimal way to experience the story? Any purists would scream, fuck no. They would argue that without earning the knowledge through the frustration of episodes 2 difficulty spikes, the emotional payoff wouldn't land. And in a sense, they're right. There were moments where the AI's explanation left me more confused. When I finally got to episode 3, I realized that characters like Voyager, the best sub-villain according to the internet, only appeared in like one cutscene and boss battle. Without playing Pied Piper, his presence was more of a lore note than a visceral threat. But here's the counter argument. It was serviceable. more than serviceable. It was liberating. By using the AI as a bridge, I was able to connect the dots of Shion's trauma, the mystery of Cosmos' soul, and the cosmic stakes of the Gnosis without burning out. I wasn't lost when I started the third game. I was primed. I had the context, the names, and the theological framework. I had effectively hacked my way into being a 10-year veteran of the franchise. The experiment was complete. I was ready to launch into Xenosaga Episode 3, the supposed masterpiece of the trilogy, to see if my unhinged methodology would actually hold up when the credits finally rolled. When I finally launched Xenosaga Episode 3, I wasn't just a player starting a sequel. I was a digital insurgent who had bypassed the gates. I closed the game with a clarity that many purists lack, precisely because I hadn't spent the 100 hours fighting the game's own history. One of the most immediate reactions in Episode 3 is how much it exposes the hollow nature of modern sci-fi RPGs, specifically the much maligned hallway design of Final Fantasy XIII. I've often defended Final Fantasy XIII's momentum, but playing Xenosaga 3 reveals what Cocoon was missing, a sense of place. In FF13, you're quite literally not welcome. You are a fugitive in a beautiful, sterile tube, moving from one combat encounter to the next without a moment to breathe or belong. Xenosaga 3 understands the welcoming paradox. Locations like 5th Jerusalem and Labyrinthos don't just feel like hubs, they feel like civilizations. They're thought out, lived-in spaces that allow you to live in the world for a moment before the cosmic forces inevitably try to tear it apart. This is crucial for the narrative stakes. When the Gnosis threaten a world, it only matters if you've walked the streets and felt its scale. The time travel elements further cement this, allowing you to see erosion of people and places from past to the present. This architectural intentionality makes the biblical scale feel earned. Then there's the combat. Transitioning from the character-based brawls to the ES mecha combat is where the Neon Genesis itch is finally scratched. The character combat is serviceable, but the ES units are the star of the show. Every time I triggered an Anima awakening, I didn't just see the flashy animation. I felt a mechanical weight of the world's most dangerous religious icons. The ES units feel like they deal actual damage, reality-altering damage. However, even a masterpiece has its limits. Towards the final stretch of the game, the boss rush phenomena begins to take its toll. Fighting boss after boss in mech form, while visually spectacular, starts to bleed into a repetitive loop. It's a testament to the game's ambition that it almost collapses under its own weight. Yet because I had outsourced the grind of the first two games, I had the mental stamina to push through. I hadn't already spent 80 hours in turn-based menus, so the late game fatigue felt more like a final hurdle rather than a reason to quit. The true victory of Xenosaga 3, however, is the narrative payoff of the Shion Mary Chaos Trinity. This is where the religious and the philosophical allegories move beyond looking cool and become the literal heartbeat of the experience. The villains, the testaments, admittedly didn't grip me as much as I expected. Missing the granular game-length buildup of Albedo or Voyager meant they felt more like high-level obstacles than personal demons. But it didn't matter. The game provided Telos, Virgil, and Pellegrini to carry the weight within Episode 3 itself. The way the story weaves 6,000 years of reincarnation, trauma, and theological rebellion into Shion's personal journey is staggering. It's a story that actually has something to say about the human condition and our relationship with the divine. I found myself staying out late, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on the ending in a way that very few modern games, perhaps only Nier Replicant, have ever managed to achieve. This leads me to the hot take that will likely alienate the modern JRPG community. Xenosaga is a superior evolution of the Xeno DNA, far surpassing the Xenoblade Chronicles trilogy. Xenoblade is a masterpiece of technical achievement and safe storytelling. It is, quite frankly, dumbed down for a broader Nintendo audience. While it touches on great themes, it lacks the raw Dante's Inferno edge that makes Xenosaga and Xenogears so vital. The whole reason Xenogears existed is because it was too dark for Final Fantasy VII. Xenosaga is a perfect middle ground, a grand, elaborate space opera that isn't afraid to make you uncomfortable. or force you to engage with deep philosophical thought. Xenoblade gives you a beautiful world to explore. Xenosaga gives you a universe to contemplate. By playing it the worst way possible, I discovered the best version of this franchise. I didn't need 150 hours to realize that Xenosaga 3 is a masterpiece. I just needed a treadmill, a pack of Zins, and asked, ChatGPT, and the willingness to treat a 20-year-old game like the story of biblical proportions it truly is.